Acts chapter 11. I spent last time talking about Barnabas. Barnabas is a guy, you want to be a Barnabas. I want to be a Barnabas. And just his character and what we know of him, his story, wow, admirable in every way that I can think of to measure. In verse 24, Luke and the Holy Spirit describe him as a good man full of the Holy Spirit and faith. And beyond his character, there were evidences of God's work through him, and it was a great number of people were brought to the Lord. The church began to thrive and grow. And one of the things about Barnabas that might get overlooked is that he was smart enough. I think it was a combination of he was smart enough and open to God's leading in such a way that he realized, I know somebody that we need him. Because there are a lot of, I know this from my own experience, there were times when I thought, well, I'm your dude. I can do all of this. When the truth really was, I can be a meaningful part of this, but I can't do all of this. And I think Barnabas was bright enough to realize, let me go get Paul. And that's what, in verse 25, then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. In other words, a lot of things get left out of that. That's not even the full verse. We don't know the thought process. We just know that Barnabas goes to Tarsus, takes a journey to get there, connects with Saul, and I don't know the conversation that went, because it's not recorded, between Barnabas and Saul, but I have to imagine that Barnabas said some form of this, that Saul, Antioch, the people's hearts are very open and God is moving, and I just know I can be a useful part of that, but we need you as well. And so, okay. I wish that conversation was recorded. Tarsus, you can look it up on a map. It's not just right next door to Antioch. And so Barnabas took a considerable trip to get to Tarsus. Then he had to look up Saul, and then they made their way back to Antioch. And then here's the last part of verse 26. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. Wow, a year. This is the beginning of the public ministry that Saul, who became Paul, became known as Paul. Saul was a Jewish name, and Paul would have been the Greek equivalent. And so now Saul goes with Barnabas, and they met with the church for a year. Because when you set things up in a church context, I'm thinking, usually most people are going to think, okay, a Sunday morning, maybe Sunday school, maybe Sunday night, and then Wednesday night. Well, we get the impression from Acts, especially later in chapter 2, that they did this. I mean, they were daily. They were together. I think it's reasonable to consider that Barnabas and Saul taught these early believers, these first believers in Antioch, daily. I don't know if you've ever had the experience. If you've been a school teacher, you know what it's like to have to teach daily. It requires a specific kind of preparation. Consider that neither Barnabas nor Saul had any other source to draw from than their own experience and what we have as the Old Testament. But I think they utilized all of that, and they taught and reasoned with the people at Antioch. And in fact, the very last part of verse 24 of Acts 11, the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. Now that's kind of cool. But you do realize that up to that point in time, they were followers of the way, they were disciples, they were followers of Jesus, they were believers, but nobody had called them Christians. And it's a term that we're so familiar with. You hardly need. So what does that mean? Well, it is an interesting thing because literally it means little Christs. If I'm a Christian, I am a little Christ. At the very farthest reach of its meaning is I am a reflection of Christ. I'm an imitator of Christ. Our world is getting turned upside down, and it has been it's just not like this is brand new. No, we have an enemy who has wanted to keep the world turned upside down, and he didn't start last week or with the last election. He's been at it since before this day that we're looking at in Acts chapter 11. But today, there are places in the world where if you are called a Christian, you have put a target on your chest. More people are dying, more Christians are dying for their faith today across the globe than ever before in human history. I've referenced these people before. There's a group called the Voice of the Martyrs, and they follow what is happening in the world and the persecution that's occurring toward Christians around the globe. It is. I don't think that we need to be all frightened by it, but we do need to be aware. We don't need to be fearful, but we do need to have some level of concern. Anyway, the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. But the first church I ever served full time was Antioch Christian Church in southwest Oklahoma City. And I just thought it was kind of cool that they had named this church. And oh, by the way, this church was established in 1889 after the Oklahoma Land Run. So it'd been there a long time on that corner. Anyway, all right, verse 27. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. Remember, the idea of coming down from Jerusalem, anywhere you were going was down from Jerusalem. Although on the map, Antioch is north of Jerusalem, and it's not a small trip. It's at least 2 hard days' journey and probably more. Some prophets came down from Jerusalem. So we need to pause and think, all right, when we say prophets, what are we talking about here? Well, prophecy has at least 2 aspects. There is the foretelling aspect of prophecy, which is the ability to predict future events accurately. Now, in the Old Testament, the law made it clear that a prophet was not a person who proposed themselves or presented themselves to be a prophet. Just their presentation didn't make them a prophet. What made them a prophet is if their prophecy came true. And if it didn't come true, there were very serious consequences. These people, and we don't know whether it was all men or men and women, but they were prophets, and we're going to see that at least one of them, had the ability to foretell the future. There's a second aspect of prophecy, that is to tell forth. A prophet is he teaches, he expounds, he tells forth the truth. And it's my belief that one of the most significant aspects of a prophet is that the truth matters more to them than anything. And sometimes a person who is of a prophet spirit can seem abrasive and aggressive and even uncaring at times. And some of that is there always will be immature prophets. They're emotionally immature, and they don't know how to, in an emotionally intelligent way, convey the truth, except by being a bull in a china closet. Look at the Old Testament prophets. They were bold because God had commissioned them, and they had a message to tell. Now, some of the prophets didn't give this very long, projected foretelling. They were primarily about calling Israel back to truth, back to God, back to His standards, back to His values and His ways. And so I think it would be reasonable to think about these prophets as probably having both of those characteristics. Later in your study, when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and in Ephesians, I think it's chapter 3, God gifts by the Holy Spirit men and women, people, to be prophets. But not everyone is a prophet. And I even think not everybody who wants to be a prophet is a prophet. Well, these people evidently were bona fide. They came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire world. That's a bold prediction. At that point in time, the Roman world was very nearly the whole earth, as people in the Mediterranean crescent would have known it. Well, there's a couple of things here. Number one, it was through the Spirit that Agabus predicted this severe famine. And another thing is, he responded to this prompting of the Spirit to give this message. All that's interesting to me, but I'm not sure I can fully get my hands around it. Well, and then Luke parenthetically records, this happened during the reign of Claudius. So why that? It's because, why did Luke include that? Because people needed to be able to verify the authenticity of the account. He wrote this to Theophilus. And so this was kind of like a historical peg that Theophilus could reference and would realize, I remember that during the reign of Claudius. Well, what happens next is too much to even get started on this time, so I'm going to pick it up next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.